Protesters gathering outside the British Parliament this week. This as lawmakers rejected the withdrawal agreement with the European Union for a third time on Friday. For more insight, let's bring in Nile Gardiner, director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation and former foreign policy advisor to the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. You know, Nile, people say American politics are a mess. What a mess the UK is in right now. I mean, Prime Minister May's deal struck down by the British Parliament 3 times now. I mean, this makes it look increasingly likely that the UK is going to exit the EU without a deal in place, right?
Well, I think there's a very strong possibility of a no-deal Brexit on April the 12th. And in fact, that's actually the best possible scenario right now, because Theresa May's deal is actually a very weak deal. It's not a great deal for Britain, and she effectively surrendered to the European Union on all of their demands. And so hence her deal has been rejected 3 times in Parliament. And now I think that there's a very, very strong chance that Britain will exit on April the 12th under a no deal, which means that Britain trades with the rest of the world under World Trade Organization terms. And I think a no deal scenario actually is the best case scenario as well for the United States.
But wouldn't a no deal scenario completely mess up the global markets and just send them into turmoil?
I think actually the markets have already worked in the possibility of a no deal. So, for example, the markets in Europe yesterday actually rose with the defeat of Theresa May's deal. So I think the markets are expecting actually the possibility of a no deal scenario. Also, a no deal actually enables the United Kingdom to sign free trade agreements with countries across the world, including with the United States. And the Trump administration has been 100% in favor of a US-UK free trade agreement. It's going to be a great force generator, I think, for jobs and prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. So there are a lot of positives here, and every European country as well is preparing right now for a no-deal scenario, as is the British government.
President Trump has said that he wants this unilateral trade deal with the UK, but he's also been very critical of how the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has handled the negotiations. As somebody who advised Margaret Thatcher at one point in time, what do you think that Theresa May has done wrong?
Well, I think Theresa May's handling of the Brexit negotiations has been absolutely disastrous. The antithesis of how Margaret Thatcher would have handled these negotiations. Well, Margaret Thatcher would have stood up for British interests. She would have stood up to the European Union. She would not have given in to any of the bullying from the EU. And after all, the European Union is treating the Brexit negotiations as a kind of punishment beating for Britain, a warning to other European countries. This is what happens if you dare to try and leave the European Union club. And so Margaret Thatcher would have stood up to the bullies. She would have stood up for British interests. She would have got a very good deal, I'm sure, with the EU. She would, of course, celebrated the idea of Britain leaving the European Union. And I think that also President Trump is absolutely right in his criticism, actually, of Theresa May's handling of this. I'm sure that President Trump would have done a far superior job as well if he was in charge.
Let me ask you this. I'm reminded of something that a previous guest said when we were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He said, it can get worse before it gets worse. Could the same be said for the UK?
Well, I think there's a real threat that Brexit may not happen at all if Theresa May caves in again to the European Union. She needs to stand up for Britain. And Brexit is a great, great force for freedom, for sovereignty, for self-determination. It's great for America as well. So I do hope that the Brexit process will move forward and that Britain can be, on April 12th, finally a truly free nation again.
Well, Nile, it'll be a fascinating few weeks and days. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your expertise. Leland?